Imagine a cold palace made of dark stones, surrounded by silent corridors and echoes of conspiracies. A boy, just 8 years old, walks alone through these halls. He has piercing eyes, observes everything in silence, and learns from an early age not to trust anyone. This boy will become one of the most feared rulers in history. And if you like stories like this one, full of twists and turns, betrayals and decisions that change the course of empires, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like and comment. Have you ever heard of Ivan the Terrible? Now hold on tight, because this story will keep you hooked until the end. Ivan was born in 1530, the direct heir to the powerful Rurik dynasty. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died when Ivan was only 3 years old. From then on, his life became a minefield. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, assumed the throne as regent, but only for a few years. It is said that she was poisoned when Ivan was 8 years old. With her death, the little prince was completely at the mercy of the nobles of the court, the infamous boyars, who fought for power without any shame or compassion. These boyars did not treat Ivan as a future tsar. On the contrary, he was ignored, neglected, and often humiliated. There are reports that he was starved within the palace itself, and that he witnessed beatings, torture, and even murders being committed right before his eyes, all while being protected by the very men who had once sworn allegiance to his family. In isolation, he immersed himself in books. He studied history, religion, and politics with an intensity unusual for a child, but he also harbored a deep resentment within himself. He saw how the boyars took advantage of the weakness of the throne and mocked him behind his back. And even as a child, Ivan began to imagine a future where he would have enough power to make all those who despised him kneel. There is a symbolic episode that many historians cite. When he was still young, Ivan would capture small animals, cats, birds, only to throw them from the Kremlin towers. Cruel behavior, yes, but revealing. A boy who never learned what affection was, only control and punishment. What begins as a sad and lonely childhood soon turns into a thirst for power that will define an entire era. Ivan will never trust anyone again, and this distrust will shape every decision he makes as ruler. At 16, while many young people barely knew what to do with their lives, Ivan already knew exactly what he wanted: the throne, absolute power, and the reverence of an entire empire. The year was 1547. Young Ivan summoned all the eyes of the nobility, the church, and the people to the Assumption Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin. But this was no ordinary coronation ceremony. Ivan did not want to be just another Grand Prince, the traditional title of Russian rulers. He wanted something greater. He wanted a title that would put his name alongside the emperors, that would bring him closer to Caesar, the ruler of Rome. And so, wearing a heavy crown of gold and stones, he proclaimed himself the sovereign Tsar of all the Russias. The first time in history that this title was used officially. The word tsar came from the Latin Caesar, and it was not just symbolic. It represented something sacred, as if Ivan had been chosen by God to rule the land, and that made all the difference. Now, he was not just a political leader, he was almost a divine envoy. This masterstroke transformed the way people viewed power. Ivan came to be treated as an untouchable figure, with total authority over the life, death, and fate of millions. And to guarantee this authority, he surrounded himself with symbols, golden thrones, luxurious robes, and a pomp reminiscent of the Byzantine Empire. Everything had one purpose: to show that now, no one was above him. But the grandeur of the coronation hid something even deeper. Ivan carried within him the scars of his childhood, and every gesture of power was an attempt to bury the humiliations of the past. Now he was at the top. But as we will see later, that top was lonely and dangerous. Shortly after his coronation, Ivan decided he needed something, or rather someone, to bring stability to the new empire he wanted to build, and perhaps even to his tormented soul. But unlike marriages arranged solely for political alliances, Ivan did something unusual. He organized a kind of competition among the young noblewomen of Russia. Hundreds of young women were brought to Moscow to be evaluated, not only for their beauty, but for their intelligence, behavior, and even health. This is how he met Anastasia Romanova, a young noblewoman from the family that centuries later would give rise to the famous Romanov dynasty. Anastasia was serene, polite, kind, and by all accounts, Ivan fell in love with her. The marriage took place in 1547, and for the first time Russia saw a side of Ivan that few had imagined existed: a loving, devoted, and surprisingly calm man. Anastasia was by all accounts the only person capable of calming the Tsar's explosive temper. During the 13 years they were together, Ivan was more rational, more fair, and even more generous with the people. She was not only a wife, She was an advisor, a comfort, a balance. Many believe that without Anastasia, Ivan would have gone mad much earlier. But like every great story, it has its tragic turn. This peace would not last forever. In 1560, Anastasia fell mysteriously ill. Fever, weakness, and then death. Swift, unexpected, devastating. Ivan was beside himself. He cried, he screamed, and then he accused the boyars of poisoning his wife, the very nobles he had hated since childhood. From that moment on, the man he had once loved became a monster without restraints. Anastasia was the last anchor of humanity in Ivan, and with her death, that anchor sank. And it was in this emotional abyss that Ivan created something that still sends shivers down the spines of those who study his history. A dark, black-clad elite troop, with the freedom to kill, torture, and spread terror under direct orders from the Tsar. They would come to be known as the Orphaned. The pain of losing Anastasia became fuel for something terrible. Ivan, consumed by rage and paranoia, began to see betrayal everywhere, especially among the nobles, the boyars, whom he had hated since childhood. It was then that he created something unprecedented, the Orphaned. But what exactly was that? It was a parallel personal force, a kind of secret army of the Tsar, answerable only to him. These were no ordinary soldiers. They dressed in black, like monks from hell, and rode through Russian cities on black horses with dogs' heads and brooms attached to their saddles, the dogs symbolizing that they were ready to sniff out treason, and the brooms that they would cleanse Russia of traitors. Macabre, isn't it? Ivan divided the country into two parts. One governed in the traditional way, and the other, the Orphaned, where he had total power, without laws, without limits, without restraints. In this dark territory, the Orphaned could raid homes, arrest without reason, torture, confiscate property, and murder. And they did it with gusto. The population lived in panic. No one knew if they would be next. All it took was a whisper, an anonymous tip, and the men in black would appear in the middle of the night, take away the suspect, and nothing else was heard. Husbands disappeared, families were destroyed. Entire villages were decimated. Russia became a stage of silent horror. The Orphaned was not just repression, it was a performance of absolute power, a spectacle of fear, so that no one would dare to challenge the Tsar. But the creation of this personal militia and the state of constant paranoia into which Ivan plunged did not come without consequences. While he pursued imaginary enemies, real enemies approached the borders of the empire, and it is in this climate of internal terror that Ivan decides to open a new front, this time against foreign powers. He believes it is time to expand the empire, but the war that is to come will be long, cruel, and full of mistakes. Amid the chaos raging in Russia's interior, Ivan looked outward. His empire was still surrounded by territories controlled by the Tatars, heirs of the ancient Mongol Empire, who had humiliated the Russians for centuries with invasions and pillage. For Ivan, conquering these lands was not just a matter of expansion, it was historical revenge, and of course another chance to prove that he was invincible. The main target, Kazan, capital of the Tatar Khanate, to the east. The city was a stone fortress, surrounded by nearly impenetrable walls. Many before him had failed in their attempts to take it, but Ivan was determined to change that. In 1552, he organized one of the most ambitious military campaigns of the time. He marched with some 150,000 soldiers, a huge number for the period, bringing cannons, modern weapons, mobile towers, and even European engineers specialized in siege warfare. He spared no resources. And so the siege of Kazan began. For months the city held out, but Ivan was tireless. He ordered tunnels to be dug under the walls and the foundations blown up. The explosions shook the ground. Then came the battering rams, the archers, and finally the army entered. The massacre was brutal. Thousands were killed. Ivan ordered the destruction of the mosques and imposed Orthodox Christianity. The message was clear: Kazan was now Russian and Tsarist. 2 years later, Ivan would repeat the feat at Astrakhan in the south, paving the way for Russian control over the Volga River, a strategic trade route. With these conquests, he expanded Russian territory as no ruler before him had done. For the first time, Russia began to transform itself into a continental empire, with access to the East and Central Asia. These victories cemented Ivan's image as a formidable leader. For the people, he was now a divine warrior, the fist of God. Monuments were erected, and to this day, a symbol of the Kazan victory still stands. The famous St. Basil's Cathedral, with its colorful domes and shapes that seem to have come out of a dream. It is said that Ivan had the architect blinded so that he would never build anything so beautiful again. But with each conquest, Ivan became more obsessed. Each victory fueled his ambition and his paranoia, and it was with this mind already corroded by power and bloody victories that Ivan made his greatest military mistake. If until now Ivan had felt like an unbeatable conqueror, the Livonian War would be the blow that made him bleed. After his victories over the Tatars and his eastward expansion, Ivan turned his eyes westward, more precisely to the Baltic regions of present-day Estonia and Latvia. There was the Livonian Confederation, a fragile alliance of Germanic nobles and Christian knights. It was a rich land, with many trade routes leading to the Baltic Sea, and Ivan wanted more than ever to give Russia a direct outlet to the sea. In 1558, he declared war, and at first it seemed like everything would work out. His armies advanced rapidly, cities were taken, fortresses fell, the Livonians collapsed and desperately called for help. That was when the situation began to change, and Ivan made a fatal mistake. He underestimated his enemies. The war drew in other major players: Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and even the Holy Roman Empire. What had been a quick campaign turned into a diplomatic and military minefield. Russia found itself fighting on multiple fronts, and Ivan, already emotionally unstable, began to lose control. Furthermore, internally, the country was collapsing. The Orphaned had left the cities deserted, the peasants were fleeing, trade was at a standstill, and the economy was sinking. It was as if Ivan had started a war at the most fragile moment of his own empire. For 25 years, Russia dragged itself through this conflict. Initial victories turned into humiliating defeats. Moscow was invaded. Entire villages were burned. The people no longer saw Ivan as a holy warrior, but as the man who had plunged the country into ruin. When the war finally ended in 1583, Ivan had lost most of the territory he had conquered. The Baltic dream was dead. Russia, exhausted, impoverished, and riddled with wounds, would still have to endure more pain, including that inflicted by the hands of the Tsar himself. Because while he was losing battles outside, inside the palace, an irreversible tragedy was about to happen. One that didn't involve armies or weapons, but blood of his own blood. Time had been cruel to Ivan. He was no longer the ambitious young Tsar, nor the ruthless conqueror of Kazan. He was old, paranoid, tormented by losses, defeats, and ghosts that only he could see. The empire was weakened, the economy in tatters, and the people were already whispering on street corners that the terrible Tsar had gone completely mad. But there was hope. His son Ivanovich, the heir, was strong, intelligent, and loved by the people. He had everything he needed to restore Russia's glory and continue his father's legacy, perhaps even do better. But father and son were tough, explosive, proud, and in an empire ruled by fear and instability, even a family disagreement could turn into a tragedy. The scene took place in the autumn of 1581. The Tsar and his son had a fierce argument. There are many versions of the reason. Some say that Ivan was irritated by the way his daughter-in-law, Ivanovich's wife, dressed and ordered her to be beaten, causing her to miscarry. Others say that it was a dispute over political decisions and the succession. What is known for sure is that the argument escalated, and then Ivan the Elder, in a fit of rage, grabbed his iron staff and struck his son in the temple with a single blow. The silence that followed was terrifying. The young heir fell bleeding. Ivan, immediately seized by panic, screamed, cried, tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. A few days later, Ivanovich died. The Tsar was never the same again. The episode shocked the entire court. The people were horrified. The future of Russia had been destroyed by the hands of the emperor himself. And this was not just a personal tragedy, it was a national crisis. The legitimate heir was dead, and the only remaining son, Fyodor, was frail, sickly, and unfit to rule. Ivan had symbolically killed the very future of Russia. And the worst? Russia would still have to face famine, social collapse, and more acts of terror at the hands of the Tsar. Because Ivan, now overcome with grief and remorse, did not retreat, he only sank deeper. After his son's death, Ivan was never the same again, and that's saying something. What was already instability turned into delirium. Ivan began to live in the grip of paranoia. Every face was suspicious, every gesture a threat, every shadow a possible betrayal. And what does a man with absolute power do when he begins to imagine enemies on all sides? He turns the whole country into a hunting ground. Ivan intensified the methods of the Orphaned, but now with even greater cruelty. The executions ceased to be occasional and became public, ritualistic, symbolic. Victims were hung, burned, drowned en masse, often in front of forced audiences, all to stoke fear. It was a pedagogy of terror. The lesson was simple: if you doubt, die. And no one was safe, neither rich nor poor, neither monks nor officials. In many cases, entire cities were destroyed on suspicion of conspiracy. The most emblematic case was that of Novgorod, one of the oldest and most important cities in Russia, known for its trade and tradition of relative political independence. Ivan began to suspect that the inhabitants wanted to ally themselves with Poland without proof. Just suspicions. What followed was one of the greatest massacres in Russian history. Freezing winter of 1570. Ivan and his troops marched on Novgorod. For 5 weeks, the city was sacked, burned, and its population was mercilessly exterminated. It is estimated that more than 10,000 people were killed: civilians, the elderly, children, and priests. Many were thrown alive into the Volkhov River, which was stained with blood. The message was clear: do not doubt me. I am the Tsar, and I am God's punishment. This period made Ivan hated by many, feared by all. And worse, while the terror spread, famine and economic collapse were already knocking on Russia's door. The horror machine he himself created was slowly devouring his own empire. As blood flowed through the cities and the war against Livonia dragged on, Russia began to rot from within, and no one felt the weight of it more than the people. Famine came like a ghost. First, the fields were abandoned. Peasants fled the plundering of the Orphaned, the violence and the ever-suffocating taxes. Then came the harsh winters, the poor harvests, and the cities filled with hungry mouths and empty hands. In Moscow, thousands were starving to death in the streets. There were reports of people scavenging for garbage, eating tree bark, and even something that is hard to say, committing cannibalism. Yes, the famine had reached that point. There was no wheat, no salt, no milk, only fear and silence. Markets closed, merchants were extorted or killed. The nobles, those who had survived Ivan's purges, hoarded food supplies as if they were gold. And the Tsar, he remained locked in his palaces, surrounded by spies, paranoid, and making increasingly erratic decisions. The Russian economy collapsed. There was no production, no foreign trade, and the tax system had become an instrument of torture. It was as if Ivan had declared war not only on foreign enemies, but on his own people. And the cruelest part was that all of this was a direct consequence of his own rule. He had created fear, but now that fear no longer sustained the empire, it only corroded it from within and without. Hunger opened wounds that would not heal soon, and when the belly of the people growls, the heart of the empire shakes. But while the people were dying of cold and hunger, Ivan continued to see himself as God's chosen one. And with this divine mantle, he turned his eyes once again to the only institution that still exerted influence, the Russian Orthodox Church. Even surrounded by blood, terror, and ruins, Ivan the Terrible continued to present himself to the people as a man chosen by God. And for this, he needed a powerful ally, the Russian Orthodox Church. Ivan was deeply religious, at least on the surface. He fasted, confessed his sins frequently, and studied the scriptures, but his faith was not a barrier to violence. It was often a justification. He believed he was acting as the divine instrument to purify Russia, as if every execution, every punishment was a holy mission against sin and treason. The church, for its part, walked a tightrope. Many priests and monks feared him, but few dared to defy him. The most notable exception was Saint Philip, then Metropolitan of Moscow, one of the greatest ecclesiastical authorities of the time. Philip publicly denounced the abuses of the Orphaned and called for divine mercy and justice. What happened to him? Ivan had Philip arrested, tortured, and finally killed. One of the Tsar's officers strangled Philip, and his body was thrown away, like that of a common criminal. Decades later, he would be canonized, a martyr of the church killed for denouncing the Tsar. Yet Ivan continued to wield faith as a weapon. He commissioned icons, prayed in public, and used biblical passages to justify his actions. He claimed to be the new David, the new Solomon, and above all, the new Christian Caesar of the East. Faith was no longer just a spiritual pillar, it was becoming a tool of authority and domination. Even when he destroyed cities or burned monasteries, Ivan always believed he was purifying the soul of Russia. But behind this devout facade lurked a man who was increasingly isolated, feared, and ignored on the international stage. While he used religion to elevate himself as a godlike figure among Russians, abroad he was beginning to be seen as a dangerous madman. And so, in the midst of internal decay, Ivan decides to do something that few imagined, to reach out to the West. But what he will find is contempt, silence. Despite seeing himself as the Tsar of all the Russias and a holy ruler, even the Fourth knew that his empire was weakened, politically and economically. External enemies were more organized. Allies, scarce. Russia needed support, especially from the West. It was then that the Tsar decided to do something unexpected, seek alliances in Europe, and not in a discreet way. Ivan wrote letters, many of them to European leaders, trying to get closer, negotiate, form pacts, and even, who would have thought, propose marriage. Yes, marriage, to none other than Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, one of the most powerful women in the world at that time. In his letters, Ivan praised Elizabeth with sweet words, or as sweet as he could be, told her she deserved a strong man, and suggested that if things went wrong in England, she might even run away to Moscow and rule by his side. Romantic, a little, desperate, quite a bit. But Elizabeth, who was anything but naive, responded with cool diplomacy. She said the proposal was interesting, but that there were many details to be discussed. In practice, it was a no. The Queen never took seriously the idea of marrying Ivan, a man known for killing his own son and torturing his subjects. The proposal became the butt of jokes in English noble circles. Ivan's other attempts with the leaders of Scotland, the Holy Roman Empire, and even Sweden also failed. The increasingly isolated Russian Tsar began to realize that for Europe he was not a potential ally, but an unpredictable tyrant. The doors to the West were closing, Russia was alone, and Ivan increasingly cornered. Yet, amid international rejection, the Tsar kept writing. Yes, writing. Because behind the image of a monster, there was a man with a pen in his hand, sarcasm on his tongue, and an obsessive desire to justify his own actions. Yes, Ivan was brutal. Yes, he killed, tortured, and spread terror. But he was also cultured, extremely cultured. Unlike what many tyrants might imagine, Ivan IV was a man who loved writing. He read a lot from childhood, history, theology, philosophy, rhetoric, and later transformed his own ideas into words as sharp as blades. His letters are precious documents, not only for historians, but for anyone who wants to understand the mind of a man who believed he was the arm of God, but who acted like a demon. He wrote with sarcasm, anger, elegance, and a logic that, in its own way, made sense. One of his best-known correspondences is his exchange of letters with Andrei Kursky, a former ally who rebelled against him. Kursky criticized the Tsar's abuses and called for justice. Ivan responded with irony, mocking his former ally's faith, calling him a coward, a traitor, and worse. It was as if Ivan was always in court, but not in the dock. No, he was the judge. He used his words to defend himself, justify his actions, and at the same time condemn everyone around him. In his letters, he mixed theological reasoning with political arguments. He quoted scripture, ancient emperors, and constantly used the concept of sin to justify violence. It was as if he were saying, yes, I kill, but I kill because it is right, because it is what God wants. Is it scary? Yes, but it's also fascinating. Through these letters, Ivan not only tried to explain the empire he built, he tried to convince the world, and perhaps himself, that everything he did was part of a greater plan. These writings show us something that is perhaps even more disturbing than a cruel Tsar. A cruel Tsar who knew exactly what he was doing and believed he was right. But Ivan did not live by ideas alone. Even surrounded by terror and obsessions, he continued to shape the structure of the Russian state, creating systems that would leave their mark for centuries. As terrifying as Ivan was, and he was, it is impossible to tell the story of Russia without acknowledging that he laid the foundations of the modern Russian state. Yes, the same man who ordered suspects tortured without trial also created rules, systems, and administrative structures that would survive long beyond his reign. From a young age, Ivan showed a desire to reorganize the chaos inherited from corrupt boyars and internal disputes, and at one point he even tried to be a reforming Tsar. Soon after his coronation, he created the so-called Zemsky Sobor, a kind of rudimentary parliament, bringing together representatives of the nobility, the church, and even the people. It was an attempt to hear different voices, even if the final decision was always his. He also created the Sudebnik of 1550, a new legal code intended to make the judicial system more uniform and less arbitrary. And he reformed taxes, standardizing charges, and combating abuses, that is, before his paranoia led him to do exactly the opposite. Another development was the creation of more tightly controlled administrative regions, with state officials appointed directly from Moscow. This weakened local lords and strengthened central power, a key step in transforming Russia from a collection of disconnected fiefdoms into a unified empire. It was also under his rule that the use of the Russian language in public administration was strengthened, replacing Slavonic and Latin in many records, which brought the state closer to the people. And even militarily, he created the streltsy, elite units that would become the basis of the Russian army for more than a century. But make no mistake, these institutions were not created out of benevolence. They were designed to concentrate power so that nothing would slip through the cracks. Ivan hated fragmentation, hated being dependent on the nobles, hated what he had experienced as a child. His state was a response to pain, an attempt to control everything at any cost. And it is this ambiguity that makes him so fascinating. A destroyer who also built, a murderer who created laws, a monster with the vision of a statesman. But no matter how hard he tried to control the present, Ivan could not escape time, and time was taking its toll. After decades of wars, bloodshed, screams and whispered prayers in despair, the Kremlin palace finally fell silent. It was March 18, 1584. Ivan the Terrible was dead. The Tsar, who had ruled with an iron fist and eyes ablaze, died in his games room during a game of chess. Some say it was a heart attack, others suspect poison. After all, conspiracy and mystery always surrounded his life. But what is certain is that with his death, an entire empire was left without direction. His pale, heavy body was dressed in the golden robes of royalty. And as the court wept, some out of protocol, others out of relief, a new question hung in the air: who will inherit the throne? The eldest son, Ivanovich, had been killed at the hands of his own father. That left only Fyodor, the youngest son, a weak, introspective, pious man, and completely unprepared to rule a crumbling empire. It was the beginning of a dark era that Russian history would call the Time of Troubles. Smutnoye vremya, a period marked by famine, foreign invasions, civil war, coups, false coronations, and the near-total destruction of the Russian monarchy. Without strong leadership, pretenders to the throne emerged from all corners, some claiming to be Ivan's secret sons, others backed by foreign powers such as Poland and Sweden. Moscow was invaded, sacked, and taken over by outside forces. The people who had already suffered so much under Ivan now faced complete chaos. Ivan's legacy was a dangerous mix. He left a centralized state, yes, but he also left a trail of fear, a power vacuum, and a traumatized people. His reign was the foundation of an empire built on bones. And even with his death, Ivan was not forgotten. He became a symbol, a ghost, a warning. But what, after all, is the true legacy of Ivan the Terrible? Was he a hero or a monster, a tyrant or a visionary, a saint or a madman? When we say Ivan the Terrible, the name already carries a lot of weight. But what exactly does terrible mean? Many people imagine it to be synonymous with cruel, monstrous, sadistic. And yes, all of that may be true. But in the original Russian, the term used was grozny, which means something more like the feared, the formidable, the powerful one who commands respect. Ivan was all that, and more. He centralized power, expanded Russia's borders like no one else had done before, transformed the Russian monarchy into an absolute throne, and planted the seeds of an empire that would one day stretch to the Pacific. He created laws, founded institutions, organized the army, and strengthened the role of the church. In the eyes of administrative history, he was a builder. But at what cost? Eloquent letters, and prayed fervently, murdered his own son. The Tsar, who claimed to protect the people, starved them to death. The leader who wanted to unite the empire divided it with terror. His government established a culture of distrust, fear as policy, and death as method. And more than that, he taught Russia that absolute power, when fueled by pain and paranoia, can destroy a nation from within. Even centuries later, Ivan is still present. His face is in paintings, his story in books, his cathedral in the center of Moscow. His figure appears in films, series, documentaries, games, and still provokes intense debates among historians. Some defend him as a necessary reformer, others classify him as the first dictator in modern history. Perhaps most frighteningly, Ivan was human, with fears, traumas, loves, and guilt. And that is precisely why his story is so fascinating, because it shows us what can happen when a wounded man becomes a god on earth. And now, after everything you've seen, tell me in the comments, was Ivan a national hero or an irredeemable tyrant? What would you have done if you lived under his reign? Leave your opinion, your like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, the past never dies, it just waits to be told. See you in the next video.